Chuck, do we have it in us to start another session here talking about and
Yeah,
thinking about the just war concept? What do you think?
sounds great. I'm ready.
Now, I'll tell you an interesting thing, Chuck. I know last week we had a session where we talked to introduce the topic, and unfortunately, we were so busy setting the chessboard, setting the stage, putting the pieces into place so that we could then talk about how the medievals thought about things, that session we didn't even have enough time to actually get into. This medieval person thought this and somebody else thought that. And so I wanted to get into the medieval content first thing here, except that I had something else that sort of popped up during the week with the research that I just wanted to share before we got into that. So I apologize. One more round of prolegomena. We're setting
Yeah,
things up. And last week we were talking about there's a very common trope or school of thought when it came to secularism. Very often we'll see secularists criticize the concept of just war as a pejorative, as something that's the kind of thing that religion would do, that we need science and critical thinking to move away from. And there's a lot more to that topic here. We're not going to be able to go into all of that. But just to say that throughout most of my life, secularists have turned the nose at my suggestion that evil is present in the world and we have to be strong to deal with it. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, is how it's often commonly phrased. And I mentioned last week this idea from Isaac Asimov, where he made the statement, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, and how that almost seemed to promote a pacifistic message. Now, interestingly enough, I was researching for our discussion today, and I came across a very interesting historical situation that's much more contemporary to us, but it has applications in our discussion with the medieval thinkers. And so basically, I found an article talking about the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. Now, he lived in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. And so he lived during the World War I, World War II period, as well as after that. And so he had to face the presence of evil, the existence of real, tangible, looking at you from across the trench evil. And how might that affect his pacifistic ideas? And so I'm not here to denigrate Russell's position. I'm here to quote this to say that people who have easy answers to such positions sometimes might have to one day find that things are more subtle and more nuanced. And so here's the article. Bertrand Russell says, this is a quote from his autobiography. He says, I found Adolf Hitler and his Nazis utterly revolting. They were cruel, bigoted, and stupid. Morally and intellectually, they were odious. Although I clung to my pacifist convictions, I did so with increasing difficulty. When in 1940, England was threatened with invasion, I realized that throughout the First War, World War I, we had never seriously envisaged the possibility of utter defeat and conquest under the German boot. I found this possibility unbearable, and at last, consciously and definitely, decided that I must support what was necessary for victory in the Second War, however difficult victory might be to achieve, and however painful in its consequences. And so the point is this, not to point the finger at Russell and say, ha, but to instead say, principled people can disagree. And the nature of life is such that it will tease things out of people that the people themselves may have never imagined. I can't imagine that Russell thought before the time of Hitler that something would happen that might change his pacifistic ideas and his doctrines and the way that he wanted things to be. There's a famous quote from martial artist Bruce Lee, and it says, everybody has a plan in a fight until they get punched in the face. And the only
hmm
idea there is that we all have our sensibilities and our ivory tower thoughts about what the way things ought to be. And yet, in the meat grinder, in the mixing of reality, in the time when we see evil for what it is, it's looking at us in the face and it's coming for us. and it's going to be them or it's going to be us. And our chances to deal peacefully with the situation are getting slimmer and slimmer. Who knows who will choose what? And I think glib ideas can sometimes go by the wayside there. So, all this to say that sometimes I think the secularists perhaps play the position for advantage in the culture wars, but when push comes to shove, even atheists like Russell had to make a decision and did make a decision. And so that's where I wanted to just wrap up the setup that we had and then get into the medieval content. But first, let me just throw it over to you for some thoughts or maybe some reflections on them.
That's helpful. I think it's fair to say that it's easy to discuss these issues from a disconnected ivory tower perspective. But when the rubber meets the road, there's often very different sort of circumstances, and you end up thinking very differently about it. And I think we've even a while back we talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Bonhoeffer's own involvement in the attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. While that's a little bit different than a just war question, I know that there was he did some sort of struggling in just determining how to be involved as well. And as I recall, he made some similar comments about how it's one thing to be thinking about these things disconnected from real events on the ground, but when you start thinking about them totally connected, it does change how you see them. And it doesn't mean that we give up sort of our intellectual thoughts about it and just let our guts take over. That's certainly not the case. But there is some reality that needs to be considered when we talk about these issues, and that reality. And I think there still are. I highly respect my pacifist friends and family. I just talked to somebody over the weekend as well who really lived out their pacifist beliefs during the Vietnam War, which led them actually into a career of peacemaking, but in a very positive way. I really respect that. But it is true that what's happening on the ground often does very much affect how we think about these things, and we have to remember that. I think your discussion of Russell points to that as well. Good stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction. So, with that in mind, maybe it is a good time to just start to deal with some of the material that Professor Russell is outlining in this chapter. And of course, in getting to the medieval thinkers, we commonly start with the transition period between antiquity and the medieval thought. And for so many things, that's a fancy way of saying, what did Augustine believe? Because he was such a giant. Now, the professor starts with the same approach here, and I loved his summary of Augustine's position. So often we can look to Augustine for maturity, well developed, almost systematic, almost doctrinal treatments for so many things that it's tempting to think that Augustine is going to be similarly precise for everything when we go to read him and look at him. And yet the professor says, and I'll just read the first sentence about this here, Augustine's thought was causal and unsystematic. Now, that's just a really intellectual way of saying Augustine didn't try to lay down a framework. We talked in the last discussion about the situational ethics of Cardinal Joseph Fletcher. And we have perhaps here in Augustine some sort of, I shouldn't say a Christian situational ethics in him, because Fletcher has taken the situational ethics into a relativistic direction, which Augustine is clearly not doing. Yet at the same time, we're not going to get that nice, neat answer that we were hoping for to look at the Middle Ages for. So the professor talks about Augustine's criteria for just war related to just cause, proper authority, and right intention. But Chuck, the what's how's the saying go? The devil is in the details. Who's deciding what's a just cause and when and where proper authority is in place? And as far as motives and intentions, who can claim to be an expert at understanding those, especially of others? And we're not off to a great start here in terms of having a framework that we can, test drive and beat around a little bit. And so, what did you think of when you read that part and you maybe tried to link the early part of the medieval period with what's going to come later?
Yeah, it is on the one hand, as you point out, and as Russell points out here, Augustine isn't particularly systematic, right? He's dealing with these issues sometimes in other contexts, sometimes individually, but not necessarily by trying to tie it all up in a bow. And so, for that reason, it can be a little bit difficult to say Augustine was definitely here, or he definitely had this position on that. And there is that sense in which the details are still going to be very important. But that said, it does seem that what Augustine does is identifies some real key issues that later medieval thinkers are really focused on. So he begins with his idea that just wars avenge injuries. And in another commentary, he expands that out a little bit. Just wars are accustomed to be defined as those that avenge injuries. And so that gets into that issue of what is a just cause for a war. Well, just cause might be to avenge an injury. But then what does it mean to avenge it? Does it mean to only in a defensive way get back what was taken from you? Is there some what is an injury? What is enough for one to say, okay, this is enough of a circumstance that we can wage war? Similarly, as you pointed out, there's this real important task to think about what is legitimate authority. And Augustine, that's the theme in a lot of his writings, is God as the authority for everything, God as sovereign. And so clearly there needs to be some thought about, is God giving authority in particular circumstances? On the one hand, at least when we look back at the Old Testament, and we see Israel waging war, that's very clear. God is actually telling them, this is what you are to do. But in the modern, or even in the late ancient world, we didn't hear God specifically calling us saying, okay, you Romans go conquer the Gauls or whatever. That wasn't there. So there has to be a determination on how to determine that authority. And the flip side to that too is this issue of, well, is it even legitimate to be a soldier? Is that the type of a job that a Christian can take? And I know that in the early church, there were a lot of places where soldiers were not welcome. And Augustine, I think rightly so, understands that if we're going to just cut people off because of a particular, they happen to be a soldier, that's problematic. What else are we going to cut people off from as a church? But then if you do that, you need to either figure out a way to deal with the fact that perhaps a war might be unjust or a soldier does end up having to kill. And what is the church's reaction to that when perhaps it's a member of their fellowship who is doing that? And so Augustine deals with things like the obedience of a common soldier to their authority, which would be their commanding officers and those kinds of things. And by putting the hierarchical view of some of these issues down, there is more protection for those at the bottom of that pyramid, the foot soldiers who don't get to make a whole lot of decisions. They're just carrying out the decisions of the persons above them. And there's a sense in which Augustine says, yeah, in those circumstances, the individual soldier doesn't necessarily have moral responsibility for that. So that's certainly an issue as well. And then later on, there's a few other areas where Russell talks, expands upon these concepts and even expands on where Augustine might be going. But we see that sort of expansion continuing into the other writers. The other thing that is interesting, and Russell does this as well, and how he progresses through the chapter. He begins with Augustine, he moves on to Roman law, he talks about canon law and theologians and what they say about these things. But the inclusion of Roman law is pretty important here because there is a sense in that Roman law is the substrate upon which some of these things are being built. And so you may have some change in the way Christians who may be leading constituent portions of the Roman Empire at this point, there may be differences in how they might respond to things, but yet you do have to take into account that Roman law. And Augustine does that. Augustine is making sort of an attempt to, as Russell puts it, harmonize the evangelical precepts of patience with Roman legal notions and situate wars within God's providence. And so this is this idea of whether it's a synthesis or whether it's at least an understanding of some of these classical ideas. And Augustine has done that on other things, and he does it on war as well. And so I found that discussion as well to be interesting, and also sheds a light a little later on some of the discussion on why are we concerned about Roman law, and why do we have this history then of the canon lawyers playing a large role, and eventually theologians playing a large role in determining what is a just war. And some of that is just the history, and it's an important history to keep in mind.
Oh, that's so well said. Thank you for that. It really brings up that we're looking at in thinking about the idea of a just war. It's a multifaceted question, and simplistic answers and models always run into A, corner cases, but also B, just leaving lopping off real distinctions that have to be considered. And these topics, like you've said, are so interesting to think about. I think one of the things that struck me reading this was through Augustine, and of course reflected in later thinkers, we have this idea that is in such stark contrast to most modern notions. And this is the idea that the church and the state, when it comes to prosecuting heretics, church heresies against church heresies, the church and the state have a common cause in Augustine's thinking. And there's a rationale here where medieval political leaders can can be a part of the church's activities against church enemies. And I think we can see an arc here. And I would love your take on this. I think we could potentially see an arc of maybe why, in the context of Europe, why that didn't work out. And ultimately, why that principle was overturned in the modern era. And we have to ask ourselves, I put myself out there week in and week out as saying that in many senses, I'm a medieval thinker as opposed to a modern thinker. Is this one of those cases? What do we think about linking together the church, with the state? And we've got the historical provenance to discuss. In other words, what actually happened during the Middle Ages when these concepts were pulled upon and when they were tested. And then we have some sort of theoretical ideas on what ought to be under what conditions. And I'm just going to say a word that I think is a flashpoint for anybody who wants to talk about theory of a just war. I think has to think they're going to go into a discussion with other people where the issues of the Crusades are going to be brought up. And I'm not looking for us to solve that here, but just to say, Chuck, when you think about these thoughts that the medievals are having and how they ultimately find an expression in the Crusades, and then eventually the turn to modernity, where even among Christians, separation of church and state, in particular, with the idea of the state not prosecuting church heretics. How would you all try to make sense of that in a way that does justice to the issues, but also recognizes that there's great harm that did happen and did occur in the name of quote unquote wholesome doctrines?